Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Kali Audio HP-1. This is a closed-back wireless headset that also has ANC available on it, and it is marketed towards the pro market. This is meant to be a reference headphone, but it's a bit of a different concept. It's not reference the way that you might think of as like the traditional this is what stuff's supposed to sound like reference, which almost like never ends up being that. It's a unique one, and it comes in at around $200. So we're gonna check it out in this video. Also, I've brought with me a listener to talk about what it's like actually making music on this device, because he has actually gone and done that. And yeah, just what the experience is like overall. So without further ado, let's get going with the video. I just want to give folks a bit of context about the brand Kali, because maybe the folks watching this are not familiar with Kali, but you should be. Kali is a very well-known, highly respected speaker brand that makes products for the pro market, but many people on the consumer side of things very much appreciate their products. So if you've researched what kind of speakers or studio monitors to get under $500 or under $1,000, it is likely that you've come across the Kali brand.
Yeah, kind of just echoing what you said, like Kali's pedigree in the world of studio monitors is substantial. They have a lot of respect because they make really good speakers at really, really affordable prices.
And that's why we've been so excited for this headphone. We wanted to see what they can do in the headphone space, and now we have it, and now we're going to tell you about it. So let's start off with the build, the design, and the comfort. First of all, this is, as mentioned, this closed back wireless. It has a couple of features. We'll get into that stuff. But as far as like the actual like ergonomics and feel and look of the whole thing, this is like the complete opposite of what you imagine like high-end audiophile headphones to be. This is the most headphone-looking headphone, which has its own kind of charm, but definitely this is nothing special when it comes to the way it looks and the way it feels. But I do find it to be reasonably comfortable, and one of the nice things about this one is that it does a pretty good job of isolating or like of passive attenuation. I just recently finished evaluating another wireless headphone that had a kind of like leather material for the pads that made it a bit springy, and it didn't isolate all that well. This one is like the opposite of that. This does a much better job of actually like coupling to the side of my head and conforming around my ear, keeping all that passive noise out, which is nice. How did you get on with the build, the design, and the comfort?
Yeah, no, full agreement here. I actually found that the pads were a highlight. They are sufficiently deep, which can't be said about a lot of closed back headphones. Sufficiently big, they're tall enough, and they're oval shaped, so getting my ear in there was totally fine. But also the way they articulate and the way they kind of sit against the side of my head, they do couple quite consistently, and I'm able to get a decent bass response at basically all seatings I've worn with this. So yeah, no real huge downsides, except for maybe the headband isn't quite as comfortable as it could be. I will say it's more padded than I think a lot of these are, but it's lightweight, so it's not really that bad.
It feels very plasticky. That's one drawback. It's a very
it doesn't feel
plasticky,
premium or expensive or anything like that. It feels and looks very much like a lot of other headphones people will have seen in their lifetime. Real quick, I just want to mention what comes in the box. You get a case, little hard shell case, not much in it, but it's just the hard shell case, the headphone, a little aux cable, like a 3.5 millimeter cable to connect to a headphone jack with a 6.3 millimeter adapter if you want that, and a charging cable, which is just USB-C to USB Type A.
So the Kali HP-1, it has ANC in it, but you really shouldn't think of this as an ANC headphone. This should be thought of strictly as a studio reference headphone, a wireless studio reference headphone with several different things to be used as the reference, right? So when we talk about reference, a lot of people think that it's a reference because that's what things are supposed to sound like, but that's not what's going on here. It's more reference to very specific things, and that's probably a better way to think about the concept of reference generally. But one of those things is the Harman target. So in their default ANC off, the studio mode is meant to be a Harman-like kind of sound signature, and then you have two other different profiles. One is called consumer and the other one is called bass.
Bass heavy, yeah.
Yeah, bass heavy. And those other sound profiles are a lot more like what you'd get with conventional consumer-oriented headphones like the AirPods Max or like the Sony WH-1000 XM5s and that kind of stuff that are maybe more V-shaped, more intense in the bass. And then the treble. And quite frankly, those ones sound truly horrible. But this is why it's kind of interesting. I think the intention here is meant to be, okay, when you're using this for your mixing and whatever it is you're doing, and you want to have that reference point to, again, Harman, then you'd be using it in the studio mode with ANC off. And then if you're trying to see what that's going to sound like on more conventional headphones for what other people are going to be listening to your mix on commonly, then you would move over to either of the other two sound profiles.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to how that's implemented in terms of the sound profiles, I think it could have been done better. But in terms of the way you actually use the device, I actually like it a lot. Because when you compare it to other headphone systems that let you emulate other headphones, like the Slate VSX or D-Sonic Real phones, you have to go into a plugin and like browse a bunch of settings and like find the headphone you're looking for and click that. And it's got to be a thing that's living on your master bus at all times. Whereas with this, it's just a double click of a button on the ear cup and you're in the other mode within 2 seconds. And I really like that when I was working with this, doing some mixing. While I didn't find any of the profiles, including the Studio one, really all that helpful for making judgments with confidence, I found that swapping between them all really quickly was interesting and useful for very specific things, like checking if my snare drum is too warm or something like that. So while, again, the curves aren't really all that great for probably a few reasons, I found that the implementation of it being on the device to be really cool, and I would like to see another product or even, Callie's next effort at a headphone to have something similar like that. Oh, and real quick before we jump into the next section, I do want to mention that there is a little bit of weirdness when it comes to using this headphone. So if you're not paired to a device, you're not going to be able to switch modes or anything like that. You can turn it on, turn it off, but that's it. Once you pair to a device wirelessly, you can only change the modes once sound has actually been played through the device. So if you pair it up and you start trying to scroll through modes, you have to play something first. Now, if you plug it in via the aux cable, you can swap through modes immediately, but you don't have access to the ANC. But that's actually probably a good thing, and we'll talk about that. Oh, and you can't listen to it while charging. So if you plug in the USB-C to charge, you're not going to be able to use the headphone.
So we should talk about now what the sound actually is. And so,
Yeah.
we've obviously measured this on the B&K 5 and 2.8. And actually, this is an instance where the measurement rigs really do matter. But let's just talk first about like the default sound profile that you are intended to use this most of the time, which is, again, studio mode with ANC off. So what does this sound like? It doesn't actually sound to me the way that Harman sounds when properly emulated. But again, that's a bit of an open question. We don't need to get into too much of that here, but basically the intention is for it to be Harman-like in some capacity. But I find that it's a bit different. The treble also has a couple of extra stabbies there for me in the sibilant range. So the S's, F's, and T's, the sh sound. And I'm not a huge fan of the way that the bass sounds with this either, but this is an instance where it's like individually every range is maybe not great for me, but the overall relationship between bass, mids, and treble is okay. So at best, I would say it sounds okay. But then it's one of those things where it's like the more I listen for specific things, the more things sort of fall apart for me a little bit in that mode. Yeah. I also think this is a bit of an issue to do with Harman generally. When you're trying to essentially match a highly smooth target like that, the reality is that these things are going to have various different resonances across different heads and ears. And I'm definitely getting some. so that's not great.
Yeah, I do think it's the kind of signature where at a glance, it's probably fine for a person. Like they'll hear, prominent bass clarity in the mids, and then, maybe some wispiness in the treble. But I find a lot of listeners aren't really too bothered by that on a first listen. But I do think if it's the kind of thing that's meant to be used as a tool, you're going to start noticing these issues pretty quickly once you start, say, comparing it to music really well, or even your own music, or when you're trying to use it as a tool and make decisions, and then those decisions have to translate to a reference speaker system, for example, you're probably not going to get very good translation with it, unfortunately. I'm not sure it actually does all that great of a job of emulating a likely speaker sound scenario, or is something that is going to be consistent on a lot of the other headphones out there.
It's probably closest to like a weirdly implemented 2.1 system.
Yeah, it's kind of got that incoherence and that really thin mid-range. It's not what I would say is what should be aimed for as the reference, at least this version of this sound. Like I think Harman is a fine target, but I don't really think this sounds like what I associate with the sound of the Harman target necessarily.
And this is the best version of the sound that you get for this, because the other modes are, again, as a tool to emulate what maybe most people are going to be listening to. Like if you think most consumer headphones are pretty bad, yeah, they did nail that, I guess. but it's not one that you would ever want to listen to, right? So I think it's like you have to think of it as that sort of like secondary reference tool, right? Where you're swapping between the modes. The one that sounds like it's supposed to be normal, and then the one that's like, this is with all the consumer flair and store demo mode at work.
Yeah.
Just tons of bass in the weirdest of places.
Yeah. And I think that's what they're going for. I think they understand that certain mix engineers will have an AirPods Max on their mixing desk for when they need to reference it against something, everyone has heard or something like that. And they wanted to make that just attainable on the single headset. But yeah, the actual sound is still pretty bad. And I think we both have issues with the practice of doing that in the first place, because it kind of creates its own little circle of confusion between, three bad sounding presets. Are you really supposed to trust any of them?
Yeah, and speaking of the circle of confusion, for folks who are unfamiliar with what that is, maybe do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the circle of confusion, put simply, is the kind of confusing peril we find ourselves in when we try to judge the timbre of a recording or a speaker or a microphone. So say you're trying to judge the timbre of a recording, you're going to do that through a reference speaker. But what if the speaker's not reference tuned? Well, then you have to judge that with a microphone. Well, what if the microphone's not reference tuned? Well, you have to go back to judging that with either a reference speaker or a reference signal of some sort. That kind of circle of confusion is what plagues a lot of the evaluation of audio devices, whether they be headphones or speakers or microphones. And the Harman target was put forth as an effort to solve the circle of confusion by normalizing the response of speakers and headphones to the same thing. We have our anchor point to judge the other stuff. Of course, what that requires is all of the headphones and speakers being tuned to Harman, which we know isn't the reality, but it's a noble goal. And with the HP-1, it is something that we think is a good idea to start with as your baseline profile, even if it wasn't achieved perfectly here.
I think the issue is that despite this being a reasonable goal, there's so many different challenges, right? Even with a product like this, where if you imagine the rig that it was measured on, even if they did achieve, Harman 2018, that's not what it's going to end up sounding like to people. And it's because of the acoustic impedance conditions. And it's also not what it's going to measure like on other more accurate measurement systems like the B&K 5128. And we see that, right? We see the evidence of that, where it's like, well, if everybody had the same acoustic conditions as the Gross 45 CA or whatever it was, yeah, that would make sense. But the reality is that we don't have those same acoustic conditions. We don't have the same ear. We don't have the same features, behind the ear that change basically everything to do with the response as it's worn. And so for a device like this, it's like that goal is just one that is unattainable. Solving the circle of confusion is unattainable. And so you see, again, the problems showing up here. The more human like you get with your measurement devices, the more revealing of the problems it is. And this is one where I think maybe if they had indexed a little bit more for the subjective sound in conjunction with maybe doing additional measurements as well to understand the ballpark, it may have ended up with a better result. Or, figured out how to make use of the B&K 5128 or more advanced measurement tools that we're on now with new standards. I think it's one where it's like the idea is cool, but the implementation just isn't quite there.
Yeah.
And the reality is like they are aware of all of this, right? Like everything we're saying here is stuff that they presumably are aware of, and that's why this device exists. Because it's sort of like there's a recognition in this product that like the circle of confusion hasn't been solved and won't be solved.
Yeah.
So that's why there's these other consumer profiles going on. But that's again just to do with the ANC off. With the ANC on,
oh God,
everything goes to hell.
Yeah.
It's just horrible. This is why, to me, and we'll put the graphs up on the screen here of what this sounds like in the various different modes with ANC on, but it's basically unlistenable with ANC on, or it's a very strange sound with ANC on. You would use this maybe like if you're on an airplane and you're just, not listening to, if you're listening to podcasts on a plane or at somewhere where you're walking around outside and it's noisy, but you would never use this the same way you would use it with ANC off, to actually, as a tool. So the ANC itself is implemented poorly.
Yeah, it's not great.
The sound quality also goes to hell when you turn on the ANC mode. So I feel like as much as this is an ANC headset or headphone, technically, it would have been better if they had not put the ANC in and just focused strictly on the pro application, the studio use case, the reference side of it, because I think that is really cool.
For sure. And I think with the ability to use ANC, a lot of people are just going to default to using it, which is probably not the way you want to use this product in particular. So yeah, it's not always a situation of more options are better. Because if the options are implemented poorly enough, it'll ruin the sound like it does here. Building off of that, I feel like it didn't need to have ANC, and frankly, I'm not sure this needed to be wireless either. Like, I feel like they could have done something where they had just a few sound profiles stored on a chip, but it's still like a wired headphone or something like that. And that would have been cool, and it would have given this one more point of utility, which is that in its current mode, it's unusable for tracking because the latency is so bad. So if they had done something that was maybe a little bit simpler, like just EQ profiles on it, and then allowed you to just plug it in with a normal aux cable or USB-C cable or something like that, I would have kind of appreciated that, because then I could have used it for like tracking guitar or vocals. Yeah, I just feel like a lot of the stuff here that is unnecessary, and it could have been a stronger product if it was maybe a little bit simpler.
So when it comes to headphones that are marketed for pro use, studio use, that kind of thing, the stuff that exists out there is typically very different from what you get with this. Things like the Beyerdynamic DT900 Pro X and the new DT900, DT990 Pro X, those ones. Would you say that this is a better idea than what those ones are trying to do? And would you recommend this one for mixing, mastering, that kind of stuff over those? Or would you still gravitate towards those ones, despite some of the misconceptions to do with those?
So I think as a concept, this does make a lot of sense to me. And if it were implemented better, both in terms of the stock sound profile as well as the other sound profiles, and it didn't have the ANC and latency problems that it currently has, I would take something like this over those headphones. Because when it comes to mixing on headphones, even if it's, pro marketed headphones, there are going to be idiosyncrasies once you place that headphone on your head that need to be either accounted for or calibrated away. And to do that, you're going to need to do some sort of equalization. And, this has that, even if it's kind of a different idea than calibrating for the errors of the headphone and instead introducing a bunch of errors that are typical to headphones. I find that this kind of idea might make a little bit more sense than just buying a single headphone and just living with that headphone's flaws. That said, I think the actual ideal here is just using a headphone you already have, or buying a decent headphone and equalizing it using measurements that are available online, as long as they're high quality. And, if you want high quality measurements of headphones, well, we have a ton of those on our forum at forum.headphones.com and on our blog at theaudiophiles@headphones.com. And frankly, I would rather recommend doing that than buying another headphone and then buying another piece of software like Slate VSX or D-Sonic Realphones, where yes, you can emulate a lot of other headphones or like a speaker condition or something like that, but very few of these things are actually transparent about what's going on under the hood. And frankly, in my experience, I've gotten a lot better results just doing it myself. So while yes, I see merit in a product like this, I still think the best option for mixing on headphones is, getting a decent headphone and EQing it yourself to kind of account for your own head and ears' idiosyncrasies.
So that basically does it for our take on the Kali HP-1. I think the gist here is that it's a really cool idea. It's just that some of the execution leaves a lot to be desired. And I think it's safe to say that we'd probably skip this one, but maybe look forward to the next one.
For sure.
But if you'd like to learn more about headphone measurements, how headphones work, or maybe how to get into EQ, we have a whole bunch of articles for you up on headphones.com, and you can also chat with us in our forum or our Discord, also linked below. Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Bye for now.
Bye, guys.